my name is Andy Foster. I'm going to be the presenter for Aerodynamics for Pilots, and if you go look at it, or decide to look at it instead, the Newton-Bernoulli's in Lift video. For a minute, I wanted to talk about why I did these presentations. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I'm a light sport flight instructor. I also have a bachelor's in aerospace engineering. And one of the things that I love doing is teaching about aerodynamics in space flight. This is aerodynamics and aviation in this particular video series. And one of the things that I noticed starting probably about 7 or 8 years ago was that a lot of the explanations I was seeing for the generation of lift, I had a lot of problems with. Now, admittedly, when I came up through both the pilot education process and through my aerospace engineering education, most of the, if I'd call them simplified explanations, were Bernoulli based. And Bernoulli explanations work fine, but they are incomplete. When I say they work fine, it's like even as an engineering student, one of the very first exercises you do is you take an airfoil and you put it in a wind tunnel and you measure the pressure distributions, and from that you can calculate lift, and all that's just very explainable, only looking at pressure velocity relationships. And that's what Bernoulli really talks about, is pressure velocity relationships along a streamline. But that's an incomplete explanation if you're trying to talk about the entire physical picture. Now, the other way as an engineering student that you learn to do aerodynamics is that you can do calculations using just momentum exchange in a system, which is defined essentially as the airfoil and the air around it. And that's great if you're working at it from, say, a mathematical approach, but neither one of the Bernoulli approaches or just looking at momentum exchange gives you a really good picture of the entire physics that's involved in lift. So a few years ago, some physics teachers, I think in high school, started saying, well, you don't need to talk about Bernoulli, you only need to talk about Newton. That's momentum exchange, essentially. And it is true that Newton is involved from the get-go. What that kind of misses is you can't explain lift without talking about those pressure-velocity relationships, especially at a simplified level. And that Bernoulli's really is nothing more than the examination of those relationships using Newton's second law, actually, along a streamline. So Newton's involved in the whole thing. So saying that you can ignore Bernoulli really isn't true either. So I didn't bring a copy with me, but there's a book that came out called Understanding Aerodynamics, Arguing from the Real Physics. And that book really does probably the best job I've seen at putting the whole picture together. And it, especially in chapter 7, talks about all the myths that are out there, because there's a lot of them, just like there's a lot of misinformation on the internet about how lift is generated. The big misconception these days seems to be how Newton's third law actually plays into the whole mechanism. Unfortunately, most of the explanations you'll see out there are incorrect, and that includes the stuff that is in today's pilot educational materials published by the FAA. And so what I've tried to do with this presentation, which is Aerodynamics from Pilots, is start from the get-go. It's a presentation designed for people that want to start at the bottom and then work through it, to explain how lift is generated by a wing, and I talk about Bernoulli's and I talk about Newton's and how they interplay together, because you really can't separate the two of them out when you're talking about lift generation. The other thing about this presentation is it centers on the relationship of angle of attack, and I hope makes it clear how important angle of attack is. As a pilot, you know, we look at our airspeeds because the only thing that most pilot operating handbooks give us is airspeeds. But the reality is, even as a pilot, the critical thing you're controlling is angle of attack. So I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. I'll also say that it's a little bit long for most things you see on the internet, but it should be a complete explanation. And it should address most of the myths that are out there and that are incorrect. If you think I've gotten something wrong, contact me and we'll talk about it. The other thing I'll say is if you already have some foundation in aerodynamics, or you're a pilot and you've been classically trained, go look at the Newton, Bernoulli, and lift video, which is also on this website, and it's a little shorter version than the aerodynamics, and it just explains those relationships, though it's actually based on the same presentation. So with that, I appreciate your time, and contact me if you have any questions, or if you ever want me to speak about any of this or any other aviation or spaceflight topic, and enjoy the video.